Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe. We are so happy to have you here with us today. Whether you are listening from your home, from your car, or maybe during your study time, we truly appreciate your time and attention. Our podcast is a place where we learn English together through real and interesting stories about our world, our history, and the events that changed it. So, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy learning English with us as we explore today's fascinating topic, the Marshall Plan, how America rebuilt Europe after World War II.
Yes. Welcome everyone to another episode of the English Globe. Today's topic is truly one of the most important and inspiring stories in modern history. After the terrible destruction of the Second World War, the world was left in deep pain. Millions of people had lost their homes, jobs, and hope for the future. Europe, which had been a centre of art, science, and culture, was almost destroyed. Cities were in ruins, factories were broken, and food was scarce. People were cold, hungry, and scared about what would happen next.
That's right, Julia. The Second World War ended in 1945, but the damage it caused continued for many years. It was not just about broken buildings. It was about broken lives and broken societies. Countries like Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom were struggling to survive. Even though the fighting had stopped, the wounds of war were everywhere. Roads, bridges, and industries were gone, and without them, it was difficult for people to work or rebuild their homes. Inflation was rising, unemployment was high, and many feared that another great economic crisis, like the one in the 1930s, might come again.
Imagine living in a city where everything you knew was gone. No electricity, no food supply, no transport system, and no jobs. Many families had to depend on small pieces of bread and soup given by relief organizations. Children couldn't go to school because buildings were destroyed. It was one of the darkest times in human history. Europe needed not just money, but a plan, a vision, and leadership to rise again. And this is where our story begins, with an idea from a man named George C. Marshall, who believed that peace could only come through recovery and cooperation.
Exactly, Julia. The Marshall Plan was not only about money, it was about rebuilding hope. It was a plan to help European countries get back on their feet, to help people work again, and to prevent political instability. America, at that time, had become one of the strongest nations in the world. The United States understood that if Europe stayed weak and poor, it could lead to more conflict, more division, and maybe even another war. So instead of turning away, the U.S. decided to help rebuild Europe, and that decision changed history forever.
And that's what makes today's topic so important, dear listeners. The Marshall Plan teaches us a powerful lesson about humanity, generosity, and shared progress. It shows us that even after the worst tragedy, nations can come together to build something new and better. It also helps us understand how international cooperation can create peace and stability. Today, many countries still follow the same idea when they help each other after disasters, wars, or pandemics.
Yes, and it also connects perfectly with our mission here at the English Globe, to learn English while learning about the world. When we understand history, we can also understand the words, ideas, and values that shape our future. So, as we talk about the Marshall Plan, you'll not only learn about world history, but also improve your listening, vocabulary, and comprehension skills.
Before we continue, we would love to ask something from you, our wonderful listeners. If you enjoy learning with us, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the English Globe YouTube channel. It really helps us grow and create more educational podcasts for you every week.
And don't forget to tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We love reading your messages. Maybe you're listening from India, from Brazil, from Afghanistan, from Egypt, or from Europe itself. Wherever you are, your comment helps us feel connected to you. Also, tell us what you think about today's topic. Do you believe economic cooperation can create peace? What lessons do you think the world can learn from the Marshall Plan today?
That's right. We read every single comment, and your opinions mean a lot to us. They help us understand what topics interest you most. And who knows, your comment might inspire our next episode. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts, even in simple English. This is a safe place for learners from all around the world.
Now, let's begin to understand the world after World War II a bit more deeply. When the war ended in 1945, cities across Europe were almost completely destroyed. In Germany, more than 70% of industrial areas were gone. In France and Italy, transportation systems like railways and ports were damaged. In the United Kingdom, the economy was exhausted from 6 long years of fighting. Across Eastern Europe, millions of people were displaced, moving from country to country, looking for food, family, or safety.
Yes, and one of the biggest problems was the lack of economic coordination. Countries were cut off from each other. Trade was broken, currencies were unstable, and there was no clear system for recovery. Europe needed unity, cooperation, and resources. But in those early years, everyone was focused on survival. Farmers didn't have seeds or machines, factories didn't have fuel or workers, and governments didn't have money to rebuild schools, hospitals, or houses.
And while Europe was struggling to survive, the United States was doing relatively well. The war had not destroyed American cities, and its economy was growing. Factories that produced weapons were now producing goods for daily life: cars, clothes, and food. America had both the money and the resources that Europe desperately needed. Some people in the U.S. thought the country should focus only on itself, but leaders like George Marshall believed that helping others would create a stronger, safer world for everyone.
This is one of the most inspiring parts of history, the idea that a nation could use its strength not to dominate others, but to lift them up. That decision changed the relationship between America and Europe forever. The Marshall Plan wasn't just about rebuilding walls and roads, it was about rebuilding trust, friendship, and peace. It showed the power of leadership, vision, and compassion after destruction.
So, dear listeners, as we move through this story together, try to imagine yourself in those times. Think about how difficult life was, and how powerful the idea of cooperation became. This story is not only about politics or economics, it's about people, hope, and the belief that the world can rise again, even after the darkest days.
Yes, and remember, every word you learn today, every story you hear, brings you closer to understanding not just English, but also the values that connect us all as human beings. So, let's continue this journey through history and language together. In the next part of our story, we will talk about how one man's speech at Harvard University changed the future of Europe. And maybe even the world.
After the war, the world was full of questions. How could peace last if countries were weak, hungry, and divided? How could people rebuild their lives when their economies were destroyed? The answer didn't come immediately. For almost 2 years after World War II, Europe struggled to find its way. Governments were confused, people were tired, and everyone hoped for some kind of miracle. It was in this difficult moment that one man stood up with a plan that would not only rebuild Europe, but also reshape the future of the world. His name was George Catlett Marshall.
George Marshall was not a politician in the usual sense. He was a soldier, a general who had served as the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during World War II. He was calm, serious, and deeply respected by everyone who knew him. During the war, he had helped lead the Allied forces to victory. But when the war ended, he did not stop serving his country. In 1947, President Harry Truman asked him to become the Secretary of State, the person responsible for managing America's relations with other countries.
Marshall accepted the job at a time when the world was unstable and full of uncertainty. He had seen the cost of war with his own eyes: cities destroyed, soldiers lost, and families broken apart. He knew that if Europe stayed weak, hunger and chaos could easily lead to another global crisis. In those days, many people were worried about the spread of communism from the Soviet Union. Economic hardship made people desperate, and desperate people often followed extreme ideas. Marshall believed that economic recovery was not only important for survival, it was essential for peace.
And so, on June 5, 1947, at Harvard University in the United States, George Marshall gave a speech that changed history. The event was a graduation ceremony, but his message reached far beyond the students sitting before him. In calm and simple words, he explained that the world faced a moral and economic challenge. He said that the United States should help Europe rebuild, not as a charity, but as a cooperative effort to restore peace and prosperity for all. He spoke about the need for mutual cooperation, meaning that every nation must work together for the common good.
In his speech, Marshall made something very clear. The world was now interconnected. If one part of it was sick, the whole world would suffer. If Europe's economy collapsed, trade would stop, poverty would grow, and peace would be in danger. He said, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." These words touched people deeply because they were filled with humanity and wisdom. He was not speaking about power or control. He was speaking about helping people recover their dignity and hope.
Yes, and that is what made his vision so powerful. He did not want to rebuild Europe by force. He wanted to rebuild it through trust, aid, and partnership. But at that time, his idea sounded almost impossible. America had just finished a costly war. Many Americans wondered why their country should spend billions of dollars to help other nations instead of focusing on their own needs. There was also fear that the Soviet Union would see this plan as a threat. But Marshall and his supporters believed that rebuilding Europe was the best way to protect peace and freedom for future generations.
The months after Marshall's speech were full of discussions, debates, and planning. Economists, diplomats, and politicians worked together to design a detailed program that could actually make his idea real. They studied which countries needed the most help, how much money was required, and how it could be used effectively. It wasn't easy. There were disagreements both in Europe and in America. But the beauty of the Marshall Plan was that it encouraged cooperation. European countries themselves had to come together and create a joint recovery program.
Exactly. This was not about America giving orders. It was about teamwork. European nations were invited to sit down together and identify their own needs. They had to share information, make priorities, and present a united plan. That was revolutionary because before the war, many of these nations had been enemies. Now they were being asked to work side by side to rebuild their continent. This cooperation later became the foundation of modern European unity.
It's also important to remember that Marshall's idea was not just about money. It was about rebuilding confidence, the belief that peace and prosperity were possible. The Marshall Plan offered loans, grants, food, machinery, and technical assistance. But even more importantly, it gave people hope. Factories started running again, railways were repaired, and farms received tools and fertilizer. Slowly, the engines of Europe began to move again.
Yes, and for English learners listening today, there's an important lesson here. The Marshall Plan teaches us that progress starts with vision. George Marshall did not wait for perfect conditions. He created them through leadership and belief in cooperation. He turned an idea into action. In English, we often use the phrase a turning point. It means a moment when everything changes. The Marshall Plan was one of the biggest turning points in modern history.
That's a great point, Julia. And maybe it's also a good language moment for our listeners. When we talk about vision in English, it doesn't only mean what we see with our eyes. It also means having imagination, the ability to see a better future before it happens. George Marshall's vision was to see beyond destruction and imagine peace built on cooperation.
I love that. And it's interesting how one speech can change the world. After Marshall's address, newspapers across the world began to discuss his plan. People in Europe felt hope for the first time in years. Governments began sending representatives to Washington to discuss the details. The plan was not yet approved, but it had already begun to inspire people everywhere.
Of course, not everyone was happy about it. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, saw the plan as an American attempt to expand influence in Europe. Stalin ordered the countries under Soviet control, like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, not to join. This created a new division in Europe: the Western countries that accepted American aid, and the Eastern countries that rejected it. This division would later become known as the Cold War.
Yes, and that shows how powerful the plan really was. It wasn't just about economics, it was about values, choices, and the kind of world people wanted to live in. The Marshall Plan gave Europe a chance to rebuild on the principles of democracy, freedom, and cooperation. It became a symbol of unity after chaos.
And what's truly amazing is that the United States invested nearly $13 billion, which would be worth more than $150 billion today, to support this vision. That money helped rebuild roads, power plants, schools, and hospitals. But it also helped rebuild trust between nations that had once fought each other.
So, dear listeners, as we think about George Marshall's vision, let's take a moment to reflect. This story isn't just about governments and economics. It's about what people can do when they believe in helping each other. It reminds us that peace is built not only through treaties or weapons, but through understanding, education, and shared goals.
That's such a beautiful message, Julia. And for everyone listening to the English Globe, remember that learning history in English isn't just about memorizing dates or names. It's about understanding the ideas that shape our world and using them to improve your English and your thinking.
Yes, and we hope you're enjoying this journey so far. Don't forget, if you're learning something new today, give this video a like and share it with your friends who also love learning English and history. And please keep telling us in the comments where you're listening from. Your stories connect us across countries, just like the Marshall Plan connected nations after the war.
Beautifully said, Julia. In our next section, we'll go deeper into how the plan was actually built, how diplomacy, cooperation, and hard work turned George Marshall's idea into a real, functioning program that changed millions of lives. Stay tuned, dear listeners, as we continue this journey through one of the greatest stories of rebuilding and hope in modern history. After George Marshall's speech at Harvard, the world began to pay attention. Newspapers across Europe and America started writing about this new idea, a plan for peace through rebuilding. People were curious. Could one country really help an entire continent recover? Could cooperation truly replace conflict? The words of Marshall's speech gave hope, but turning that hope into real action would take hard work, trust, and careful planning.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened next. In the months following the speech, leaders from both sides of the Atlantic began to discuss how to make this vision real. The idea of giving massive economic aid to other countries was completely new. Nothing like this had ever been done before. The United States had to design a program that was not only generous, but also practical, fair, and effective. American diplomats worked closely with economists and planners to find a way to rebuild Europe step by step.
One of the first big challenges was political. In the United States, Congress had to approve the funding. Many lawmakers were unsure if spending billions of dollars abroad was a good idea. Some believed that America should focus only on its own people after the war. Others worried that the plan might not work, or that it could lead to corruption. But supporters of the plan, including President Harry Truman, argued that this investment was essential for peace. They believed that helping Europe recover would create new markets for American goods and protect democracy from falling under communist influence.
At the same time, something very special was happening in Europe. For the first time in history, European nations that had fought against each other for centuries began working together. 16 countries, including France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway, joined the discussions to create a joint recovery program. It was not easy. Each country had its own problems, its own needs, and its own political opinions. But they all agreed on one thing: unity was the key to survival.
That's such an important point. Cooperation among so many different nations was a new concept. In fact, this process laid the foundation for what would later become the European Union. The United States encouraged this cooperation because it wanted Europe to learn how to solve its problems collectively. The plan was not just about sending money, it was about building systems of partnership.
And that's why the plan was officially called the European Recovery Program, ERP. The name Marshall Plan came from the public and the media to honor the man who inspired it. But the official name reflected the true purpose. It was not just an American project. It was a joint effort between the United States and Europe.
Yes, and when the plan was finally approved by the U.S. Congress in 1948, it became one of the largest foreign aid programs in human history. The total cost was around $13 billion, which would be worth more than $150 billion today. To manage such a huge program, the U.S. created a special organization called the Economic Cooperation Administration, ECA. The ECA's job was to coordinate with European governments, supervise projects, and make sure the aid was used properly.
Exactly. And the ECA worked closely with another new organization formed in Europe, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC. This group included representatives from all the participating European countries. They met regularly to decide how the aid should be distributed, which industries needed support first, and how to make trade easier between nations. This collaboration made sure the Marshall Plan was not just money going one way, it was a two-way partnership.
That's right, Julia. One of the smartest features of the plan was how it combined aid with accountability. Instead of giving free money, the United States provided a mix of grants and loans. European countries had to use the funds responsibly and report their progress. They used the aid to buy American goods, such as machinery, raw materials, and agricultural products, which helped both sides grow. America gained stronger trade partners, and Europe gained the tools it needed to rebuild.
And what's fascinating is how the aid was used. For example, factories in France and West Germany received modern equipment, which made production faster and cheaper. Farmers in Italy got new tractors and fertilizer to improve their harvests. In the Netherlands, ports and bridges were rebuilt to restart trade. Even schools, hospitals, and homes were restored. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild economies, it rebuilt lives.
Yes, and it also helped bring new technology and knowledge to Europe. American engineers, economists, and planners visited European countries to share ideas about modern production, management, and trade. This exchange of knowledge helped Europe become more efficient and competitive. In return, Americans learned more about European culture, traditions, and industries. It was a bridge of understanding between two continents.
For English learners listening today, this is a great example of how cooperation and communication can make a difference. When people share ideas and work together, they can solve even the biggest problems. The Marshall Plan was successful because it focused on teamwork, transparency, and trust. 3 words that we can all learn from.
That's a wonderful point, Julia. And it's also interesting to think about the timeline. The Marshall Plan lasted for 4 years, from 1948 to 1952. During that time, countries reported significant improvements in their economies. Production levels rose, trade between nations increased, and people started to find jobs again. Europe was slowly recovering from its deepest crisis.
Of course, there were still many challenges. Some critics argued that the plan favored certain countries over others. Others said it made Europe too dependent on the United States. But even critics could not deny the visible results. By the early 1950s, European factories were running again. Markets were active, and the standard of living was improving. The spirit of cooperation had replaced despair.
And one of the most symbolic results of this cooperation was the creation of stronger diplomatic ties between the United States and Western Europe. This partnership later led to the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which aimed to protect freedom and security in the region. In a way, the Marshall Plan not only rebuilt economies, but also built friendships and alliances that still exist today.
Yes, and I think that's what makes this story so inspiring. It shows how vision and cooperation can change the world. From a single speech came an idea. From that idea came a plan. And from that plan came a new Europe, stronger, united, and ready to face the future.
So true. And for our listeners, I'd like you to think about this question. What do you think made the Marshall Plan successful? Was it the money, the management, or the spirit of unity behind it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions from around the world.
Yes. And if you're enjoying learning with us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the English Globe. Every week we bring you new stories that help you learn English while understanding our world better. Your support helps us grow and continue creating more educational podcasts for learners everywhere.
In the next part of our story, we'll look closely at how the Marshall Plan was put into action, how the aid reached people, how economies began to move again, and how this program gave millions of Europeans a new start after years of suffering. Stay tuned, dear listeners, as we continue this incredible story of hope, leadership, and rebuilding.
Now that we understand how desperate Europe's condition was, let's talk about how the Marshall Plan actually worked. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States sent around $13 billion in aid to help rebuild Western Europe. A huge amount of money at that time. But it wasn't just money being sent across the ocean. The aid came in many forms: food, machinery, fuel, and technical knowledge. The goal was to help countries stand on their own again, not to keep them dependent forever.
That's right, Julia. The Marshall Plan wasn't simply about writing checks. It was a well-organized system that involved cooperation between the U.S. government and European nations. Each country had to create a recovery plan explaining what it needed most, whether it was steel for factories, tractors for farming, or coal for power plants. The United States then provided those resources through grants and loans. For example, France received massive shipments of machinery to rebuild its railways and repair its transportation network, which had been almost completely destroyed during the war.
Germany, too, was one of the biggest recipients. American aid helped German factories reopen and produce goods again. This not only gave jobs to millions of workers, but also revived Europe's overall economy. In Italy, the Marshall Plan helped farmers by supplying seeds, fertilizers, and new farming equipment. This support boosted food production, ending years of hunger and shortages. Step by step, European nations began to breathe again. Trade restarted and shops reopened. It was like watching a continent slowly come back to life.
And we should also remember that the aid wasn't just about giving things away. The U.S. also sent technical experts and advisors to Europe. These experts trained workers, improved industrial techniques, and helped modernize production systems. For example, American engineers introduced new methods for building bridges and repairing electrical grids. Economists worked with European officials to stabilize currencies and control inflation. This partnership created a new kind of economic cooperation between America and Europe.
Yes, Adam. And that's what made the Marshall Plan truly special. It was based on partnership, not domination. European countries had to work together to use the aid effectively. They created an organization called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, or OEEC, to coordinate the funds and make sure each country got what it needed most. This collaboration laid the foundation for a more united and cooperative Europe. Many historians even say that the Marshall Plan helped inspire what later became the European Union.
That's a powerful point. The plan wasn't just about rebuilding cities. It was about rebuilding trust. America's investment gave hope to millions of people who had lost faith in the future. It showed that economic recovery and political stability could go hand in hand. By investing in Europe, the United States was also investing in peace. The plan reduced poverty, created jobs, and prevented the spread of communism, all while strengthening democratic governments.
And the results were remarkable. Within a few years, Europe's economy began to grow faster than anyone had expected. Industrial output rose by more than 35%. Agricultural production improved, trade flourished, and people's living standards increased. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild buildings, it rebuilt confidence, optimism, and friendship between nations. It was truly a story of dollars turning into hope.
Absolutely, Julia. And in many ways, the Marshall Plan marked the beginning of a new world order, one where nations work together to create peace through prosperity. It's a perfect example of how economic support can bring stability and unity. But there's more to explore, because behind the scenes, the plan also changed America's role in global politics forever.
Adam, while the Marshall Plan is often remembered as a great success, it's important to remember that not everyone supported it, either in America or abroad. Inside the United States, there were many voices of doubt and disagreement. Some American politicians and citizens questioned why their government was sending billions of dollars to Europe when many families in the US were still recovering from the effects of war. They argued that this money could have been used to improve schools, build homes, or support returning soldiers. The idea of spending so much abroad seemed risky and even unnecessary to many taxpayers.
That's true, Julia. In the late 1940s, the U.S. government had to convince the public that this plan wasn't just charity. It was a strategic investment in global stability. Supporters of the plan argued that a healthy Europe would benefit the United States too, by creating strong trading partners and preventing the rise of new dictators or extremist ideologies. Still, debates in Congress were heated. Some believed that helping foreign nations was not America's responsibility, while others thought it was the only way to secure long-term peace.
And the disagreements didn't stop there. The Soviet Union, which had been an ally of the US during World War II, saw the Marshall Plan as a direct threat. Soviet leaders believed that the plan was a tool for American influence in Europe. They argued that by giving economic aid, the US was trying to control European politics and spread capitalism. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, not only rejected the Marshall Plan, but also forbade Eastern European countries from accepting the aid. Nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were pressured to stay away, even though they desperately needed help to rebuild.
Yes, that was one of the turning points that shaped post-war history. When Stalin blocked Eastern Europe from joining the plan, it created a clear line between East and West, between the capitalist democracies supported by America and the communist states controlled by the Soviet Union. This division was more than political. It was economic and ideological too. While Western Europe received money, machines, and food from the United States, Eastern Europe remained under tight Soviet control and faced much slower recovery. This divide eventually became what we know as the Cold War.
Exactly, Adam. The Marshall Plan, while aiming to promote unity, indirectly deepened the division of Europe. The West became more connected through trade and cooperation, while the East grew more isolated under the Soviet system. The two sides began competing for global influence, not through open war, but through economic power, technology, and ideology. The Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had described became a reality. Yet, despite these tensions, the Marshall Plan went forward successfully in Western Europe, transforming it into a region of prosperity and stability.
That's an important point. Even though the plan faced criticism and opposition, its results spoke for themselves. Western European countries rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Factories were working again, cities were being reconstructed, and democratic institutions became stronger. While it couldn't solve every global problem, the Marshall Plan proved that cooperation could achieve more than conflict. It showed the world that rebuilding through partnership was possible, even in the shadow of political tension.
In the end, Adam, the challenges and criticism only highlight how ambitious the Marshall Plan truly was. It was not easy to convince nations to trust each other after years of war and suspicion. Yet it happened, and it worked. The plan didn't just rebuild Europe, it reshaped the global balance of power. It set the stage for decades of peace and prosperity in the West, even as it opened a new chapter of rivalry with the East.
Well said, Julia. The Marshall Plan may have faced strong opposition, but its legacy reminds us that bold decisions often come with risk. Without it, the story of post-war Europe, and even the world, might have been very different. Julia, after facing all the criticism and political challenges, what really proved the value of the Marshall Plan were the results. The years that followed, especially between 1948 and 1952, are often called Europe's economic miracle. It was a time when the continent rose from the ashes of war faster than anyone expected. Countries that had been in ruins just a few years earlier began to thrive. Factories reopened, trade routes were restored, and people's lives started to change dramatically.
That's right, Adam. The transformation was visible everywhere. In France, new railways and roads connected cities that had been isolated for years. Germany's industries started producing steel, cars, and machinery again, making it one of the driving forces behind Europe's recovery. Italy's farms began to flourish, feeding the population and even producing food for export. People who once stood in long lines for bread could finally afford to buy fresh produce, new clothes, and even small luxuries. It was as if a wave of hope had swept across Europe.
The numbers tell a powerful story, too. By 1952, industrial production in Western Europe had increased by more than 35% compared to 1938, before the war began. The gross domestic product, or GDP, of countries like France, West Germany, and Italy rose rapidly each year. Unemployment fell sharply as millions found work in factories, construction, and trade. For many, it was the first time in years that they could plan a stable future for their families.
And let's not forget the impact on daily life. Streets that were once dark and empty came alive again. Cities like Paris, Rome, and Amsterdam began to rebuild their cultural life. Theatres reopened, universities expanded, and new art and music filled the air. The Marshall Plan didn't just bring money, it brought confidence. It gave people the belief that recovery was possible and that cooperation among nations could achieve great things.
Absolutely. And along with economic growth came a new wave of modernization. European industries began adopting American technology and business methods. American companies shared new management techniques, advertising strategies, and production systems. This led to greater efficiency and innovation across Europe. Cars, washing machines, and radios, once symbols of luxury, became part of everyday life. These changes created a new middle class that valued progress, education, and international cooperation.
That American influence was seen not only in factories, but also in culture. American movies, fashion, and music started spreading throughout Europe, shaping a new lifestyle. Yet, it wasn't about replacing European identity. It was about blending ideas. The Marshall Plan helped create an exchange of cultures and knowledge that brought Europe and America closer together. It was a time of optimism and shared purpose, where rebuilding wasn't just about bricks and steel, but about minds and values too.
And what made this recovery even more remarkable, Julia, was that it wasn't limited to a few countries. Almost every nation that participated in the Marshall Plan experienced growth. The Netherlands rebuilt its ports and became a hub for European trade. Belgium expanded its mining and steel industries. Even smaller countries like Norway and Denmark benefited through investments in infrastructure and shipping. Europe became a network of cooperation, a connected economic community where progress in one country supported growth in another.
Exactly, Adam. The Marshall Plan transformed Europe from a region of destruction into a region of opportunity. It gave birth to what some historians call the Golden Age of European growth. From the late 1940s through the 1950s, living standards kept rising, children returned to schools, and nations began working together instead of against each other. The idea of unity that the Marshall Plan inspired eventually became the foundation for future organizations like the European Union.
And perhaps the most important result of all was the sense of confidence that returned to the people. After years of fear, hunger, and uncertainty, Europeans could once again dream about the future. They had jobs, homes, and hope. The Marshall Plan didn't just repair buildings, it repaired spirits. It showed that cooperation, generosity, and shared goals could turn destruction into development.
Well said, Adam. The economic miracle of post-war Europe wasn't magic. It was the result of planning, partnership, and perseverance. It stands as one of the greatest examples in history of how nations can come together to rebuild and thrive. The story of those years reminds us that even after the darkest times, renewal is possible when people work side by side. Adam, by this point, it's clear that the Marshall Plan was more than just an economic project. It wasn't only about rebuilding factories or giving financial aid. It was about rebuilding the political and social foundations of Europe. The plan helped shape a new kind of Europe, one that valued democracy, cooperation, and peace. After years of war and dictatorship, people were ready for a new beginning. The Marshall Plan gave them both the resources and the inspiration to create it.
That's absolutely right, Julia. One of the most powerful outcomes of the Marshall Plan was the strengthening of democratic institutions. The aid came with the expectation that governments would be transparent and accountable in how they used the money. This encouraged European nations to rebuild their political systems around democratic values, open elections, free speech, and fair governance. In this way, the plan didn't just rebuild economies, it rebuilt trust in democracy itself.
And it also encouraged cooperation between countries. Before the war, many European nations had seen each other as rivals. Borders, trade barriers, and mistrust kept them divided for centuries. But the Marshall Plan changed that mindset. To manage the American aid efficiently, countries had to work together. This cooperation led to the creation of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, or OEEC, in 1948. The OEEC became a symbol of unity. It helped coordinate recovery plans and made sure that resources were shared fairly among nations.
Exactly. And the OEEC was just the beginning. The habit of working together, sharing goals, and building economic links paved the way for even deeper forms of integration. The ideas born during the Marshall Plan years eventually inspired the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which was the first real step toward what later became the European Union. You could say that the Marshall Plan planted the first seeds of European unity, an idea that changed the continent forever.
Beyond politics and economics, the Marshall Plan had an enormous social and cultural impact too. It helped rebuild schools, universities, and research centers, giving millions of young people the opportunity to study again. Education was seen as the foundation for peace and progress. American universities also welcomed European students, creating a new generation of leaders who understood both sides of the Atlantic. This exchange of knowledge built bridges of friendship and understanding between nations that had once been enemies.
And it wasn't just education. The plan helped transform European society. As living standards improved, people began to focus more on innovation, creativity, and community. Cultural life returned to the cities. Films, art, and literature flourished again. People started to see themselves not just as citizens of one country, but as part of a larger, interconnected Europe. That sense of shared identity, born from cooperation and mutual support, became one of the plan's greatest achievements.
I agree, Adam. The Marshall Plan also changed how nations interacted globally. Europe regained confidence and became a strong partner to the United States, rather than a dependent region. The transatlantic relationship grew closer, based on shared democratic ideals and mutual respect. Together they built international organizations like NATO and the United Nations into stronger forces for peace. This collaboration helped maintain global stability in the decades that followed.
The beauty of the Marshall Plan was that it wasn't forced upon Europe. It was built through partnership. The U.S. provided the resources, but the European nations provided the vision and effort. They decided how to use the aid, how to rebuild, and how to shape their future. This balance of help and independence allowed Europe to rebuild not just its cities and economies, but also its identity, one based on freedom, cooperation, and hope.
Well put, Adam. In the end, the Marshall Plan gave Europe more than just recovery. It gave it direction. It encouraged nations to choose democracy over division, progress over fear, and unity over isolation. It showed the world that rebuilding wasn't only possible through power, but through partnership. That is why, even today, the Marshall Plan is remembered as one of history's greatest acts of international cooperation. A true rebirth of Europe in every sense.
Julia, to truly understand the Marshall Plan, we have to place it in its larger global context, the beginning of the Cold War. When the war ended in 1945, the world was divided between two superpowers with completely different visions for the future. The United States believed in democracy and free markets, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and centralized control. Europe became the main stage for this new ideological battle. The Marshall Plan wasn't only about rebuilding economies, it was also a tool in this struggle for global influence.
Exactly, Adam. The United States realized that poverty and instability could make European countries vulnerable to communist movements. In places like France and Italy, communist parties were gaining popularity because people were desperate and hopeless. So, the Marshall Plan became a way to show that democracy could deliver real results. By helping people rebuild their lives, the US wanted to prove that freedom and prosperity could go hand in hand. This approach later became known as the policy of containment, containing the spread of communism not through war, but through stability and opportunity.
That's such an important point. The Marshall Plan was the economic side of a much broader strategy. While military alliances like NATO would later protect Europe's security, the Marshall Plan worked through cooperation and development. It turned American power into something constructive rather than controlling. Instead of using force, the U.S. used food, machinery, and investment to win trust and build long-term partnerships. This peaceful form of influence became a model for how nations could project power without violence.
Yes, and it was a new kind of diplomacy, one that used hope instead of fear. By helping Western Europe rebuild, the US also strengthened its political allies. Stable democracies meant stable partners in trade, defense, and global leadership. This economic revival gave Western Europe the confidence to resist Soviet pressure and created a united front in the face of communist expansion. The Marshall Plan, in that sense, wasn't just an act of generosity. It was one of the most effective geopolitical strategies of the 20th century.
And what's remarkable, Julia, is that this approach shaped the modern world order we live in today. The United States emerged from the war as the leading global power, but instead of isolating itself, it chose engagement. By investing in Europe's future, America created a network of allies that shared common values: democracy, open trade, and cooperation. This alliance became the foundation of what we now call the Western world. It proved that prosperity could be a weapon for peace.
Exactly. And this peaceful competition between the US and the Soviet Union defined the Cold War for decades. While the Soviets built their influence through control and ideology, the Americans built theirs through partnership and progress. The Marshall Plan helped to draw that line clearly. It was a symbol of what the free world stood for. It told people that freedom was not only about politics, but also about the ability to live well, work freely, and dream of a better future.
And the results were visible, Julia. The success of the Marshall Plan made America's model of democracy more attractive across the world. It inspired similar programs in Asia, Latin America, and other developing regions. The U.S. realized that helping others grow stronger could, in turn, make the world safer and more balanced. This idea, using economics as a bridge instead of a barrier, became one of the guiding principles of modern diplomacy.
In that way, Adam, the Marshall Plan wasn't just a policy for post-war Europe. It was a blueprint for global peace through cooperation. It showed that rebuilding economies could prevent wars and that economic aid could be more powerful than any weapon. It was one of the rare moments in history when power was used to build rather than to dominate. The world that emerged from it, the alliances, the shared institutions, and the belief in collective progress, all trace their roots back to this remarkable plan.
Well said, Julia. The Marshall Plan transformed America's role in the world. It turned the U.S. into a leader not only in strength, but in vision. It proved that leadership could mean guiding others toward prosperity instead of ruling them through fear. And in doing so, it set the stage for a new era, one defined not by conquest, but by cooperation.
Adam, as we reach the final part of our story, it's inspiring to reflect on what the Marshall Plan truly represents. After years of destruction and despair, America made a decision that could have gone another way. Instead of punishing Europe or focusing only on its own recovery, the United States chose to help. It chose cooperation, not retaliation. It chose hope, not fear. And this decision changed the course of history. Europe rose from devastation, economies revived, and millions of people regained confidence in the future.
That's beautifully said, Julia. The Marshall Plan wasn't just a program of financial aid, it was a statement about human values. It showed that generosity, partnership, and vision could overcome destruction. It laid the foundation for modern democracy in Europe, strengthened transatlantic ties, and created a world where nations could work together rather than fight against each other. The plan reminds us that recovery is possible when leaders choose collaboration over conflict.
And the impact was not only political or economic. It was also personal. Families could eat again, children could attend school, and communities could rebuild their homes. The Marshall Plan gave ordinary people hope that life could be better, even after unimaginable hardship. It demonstrated that when nations unite with a common goal, they can achieve extraordinary results. This is a lesson that goes beyond history books. It is a principle that can guide our lives today.
Exactly. And for our listeners, this message is especially important. Learning from history isn't just about remembering facts. It's about understanding ideas that can shape the present and future. Cooperation, generosity, and understanding are not just tools for nations. They are keys to building stronger communities, better friendships, and meaningful human connections. The spirit of the Marshall Plan shows that even after the darkest times, recovery is possible through working together.
So, dear listeners, as you study English and explore the world, remember this lesson from history. Just as the Marshall Plan helped nations rebuild, your efforts to learn, share, and communicate can build bridges between people and cultures. Every conversation, every word learned, and every idea shared contributes to understanding and unity. The same principles that helped Europe rise again after the war.
In the end, the Marshall Plan is more than history. It is a symbol of hope, a reminder that human effort combined with compassion can transform lives. It teaches us that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in helping them thrive. And that lesson is timeless.
Yes, Adam. And for our listeners here at the English Globe, let this inspire you not only in learning English, but also in building connections across the world. Work together, be kind, and never underestimate the power of shared hope.
Thank you so much for joining us today, dear listeners. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from and how the story of the Marshall Plan inspires you. Remember, even small actions of cooperation and understanding can make a big difference in nations, communities, and our own lives.
We'll see you in the next episode with another fascinating story from history, where we explore lessons that help you learn English and understand our world better. Until then, keep learning, keep listening, and keep building bridges of hope.